Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the SimNFL show, real talk about fake sports. I am your host and commissioner. You can call me Pierce. Today, we're going to be talking all about Week 7 of the 2024 NFL season over at simfba.com. Come check us out on the website and on Discord. We would love to have you. So, as I said, we're going to cover all the usual stats and summaries from all of the Week 7 games. We're going to cover my picks for the players of the week, talk about injuries and review the current standings, and then see what is ahead for us in Week 8. So, diving right in, we had our Thursday night game between the Cardinals and the Cowboys. This one happened rather predictably, I think, between one of the powerhouses of the conferences and one of the teams in line for the number one pick. So Jesse Knoll, fantastic, 22 of 31. Bruno Hansen with 5 touchdowns on only 13 carries. That is not a typo. He had a fantastic game, and the Cowboys scored early and often in this one and dominated. 63-3 was the final score in that one. Cardinals still looking for their first win of the season. Moving on into the Sunday games, we had the Falcons and Bills play a close game here. Bills got off to a very slow start. In their first 2 drives, they lost a fumble. Second drive, fumbled again, but recovered it, and then Asensio threw one of his interceptions. He would have 3 on the day. So very tough start for the Bills. Asensio would end up with 3 interceptions and a fumble, in fact, but the Bills would come back for that and put together a 21-14 victory. Asensio ultimately throwing 56 passes for 296 yards and getting a touchdown in there. For the Falcons, big standout was Adrian Gerner with a couple of picks. But Chris Frazier struggling under 50% completion rate with a touchdown and 2 picks. So we will see if Padilla starts for them next week after the big trade with Washington. But as it stands now, a big victory for the Bills despite the turnovers in this one. Another game between the Patriots and the Texans. Another victory for the AFC East with, again, the Patriots overcoming some turnover difficulties. Rashawn Lyons with 4 interceptions, although he did find Matthew Cunningham for 138 yards and one of his 2 touchdowns. Ultimately triumphing over Hiram Moran and the Texans. Moran with a couple of picks and only 40 yards on 10 completions. But Ryan Johnson still playing like a star, set up for probably his 3rd consecutive Pro Bowl in his 3rd season as a fullback with 149 yards and a couple of touchdowns. Also worth noting, Larry Arwood all over the field for the Patriots with 15 tackles to lead all players this week, and 3 of those for loss. So Patriots keeping pace in that AFC East with a victory over the Texans. Had a very, very close game between the Eagles and the Titans, with the Eagles squeaking out a 1-point victory. Pool Party accounting for 3 touchdowns, 2 through the air and 1 through the ground. Kristen Pillardi also having a great game. Wayne Reimer, though, really came into his own today, led them to an early 21-7 lead, finished with 380 yards and 3 touchdowns. With a big day for both John Morey and Mark Spencer as well. So the Titans were up 21-7 early, and then they also scored right before halftime to get it to 27-14. But the Eagles fought back in the 3rd quarter, scored a couple touchdowns, took the lead. The Titans had one last drive in the 4th quarter, unfortunately ran out of time on the Eagles' 16-yard line. So a loss for the Titans and the Sim, unfortunately, as they were in field goal range. So a very impressive result. This is not what I was expecting. I thought the Eagles were going to roll in this one, but Reimer put up a big fight and had them in scoring position at the very end. So again, it's the NFL. I don't know if moral victories count, but strong performance from the Titans. Eagles escaping with a win in a very competitive NFC East division. Another surprising game, another close one, with the Colts coming out ahead of the Jaguars. 18-14 was the final in that one. Jacksonville scored both their touchdowns in the first quarter and then were shut out for the rest of the game. Gary Freitag, again, doing absolutely all of it for the Colts. 250 total yards, ground and air, and both of those touchdowns. Although John Osmond doing his part on defense with 3.5 sacks of Matt Howard. Howard had the Jags in position. They were driving down 14-15 in the final 2 minutes. He did throw that one costly interception right at the end of the game that allowed the Colts to run out the clock and tack on another field goal at the end for the final score. So a close one and a big division victory for the Colts in this one. A very, very good game, divisional game between the Bears and the Packers, happened as well in the early slot. Gerald Lewis over 100 yards on the ground to go with 177 yards and a touchdown through the air. And two tight ends really showing up big for their teams, Jamie Ramirez and Ramek Phelps, both with big games, and Carl Batiste with a couple of interceptions. So this one started early for Chicago. They were up 13-3. And then the Packers, through the second and third quarters, rattled off 17 uninterrupted points to go ahead and take the lead. But then late in the fourth quarter, Chicago put together a 13-play, 75-yard drive, including a 10-yard Lewis run on a 4th and 1 that ended in the end zone, and they tied it at 20. Then Green Bay threw an interception, and Chicago was actually back on pace to score again before they also ran out of time. Another unfortunate fourth quarter ending. But this ended up working out because even though the Packers got the ball first in overtime, Garibay threw his second pick, and Chicago drove for the winning field goal. So two very costly turnovers for Garibay after an otherwise very solid game led to the difference in this one, and the Bears came out with the overtime victory. The Panthers shut out the Saints to continue their dominance in the NFC South. We see the sack totals for Eric Schaefer and Caleb Suarez. That was just the tip of the iceberg because there were 16 sacks in this game from both teams. In total, 15 different players registered at least a half a sack. In total, there were 9 players who combined to sack Ben Rivera 10 times. Defense also picked him off 3 times. So an absolutely shut down performance from the Panthers defense. Saints defense did what they could as well with turnovers and sacks, but weren't able to get any points on the board. And so Panthers, again, looking to dominate that division with a big shutout victory of the Saints. It was another close game, another sack-happy game between the Chiefs and the Jets. There were 10 sacks in this game, 5 on each side. Vaughn Johnson leading the way with 4.5 tackles for loss and 3 of those sacks. Quarterbacks combining for 3 interceptions as well. And John Peters did have a fumble. So a lot of sacks, a lot of turnovers in this defensive-happy, low-scoring game. The Chiefs got all of their points, Chiefs had a 15-7 lead, not all on field goals, but they had a 15-7 lead going into the fourth, and then it was the Jets' turn to put together a big drive. 12 plays, 71 yards. Myron Everett leaves them down the field, and James Carter got the last of his 3 touchdowns to ultimately... that was the second touchdown for Carter. And they got a 2-point conversion. And so with just under 2 minutes to go, it was tied at 15. Chiefs got into range for a field goal at the end of regulation. Rob Downing had been 3 of 3 on the game, but he missed a 30-yarder that would have won it. So it went to overtime, where Carter, for the Jets, got his 3rd rushing touchdown and got the victory, got revenge over his former team, the Chiefs. And so another great overtime game, another big win for the Jets in this one. On the other end of the spectrum, the Steelers-49ers game was pretty much over after the first half. It was 31-7, and so Steelers backups got significant playing time in the fourth quarter. But Dario Tomeo made the most of his playing time, 218 yards and a couple touchdowns. Robert Morris threw for a couple as well. And so the Steelers put on a big show and a big hurt against the 49ers. Rookie Solano completed about 50% of his passes, 142 yards, a touchdown, and a pick in this one. Raiders putting up another big offensive day, defeating the Lions 47-16. Yet another sack-happy game with 4 on each side in this one. Hickson threw for 418 yards and 3 touchdowns. Big days for both Charles Brown and James Blank of the Raiders as well. Also a big day for Sylvester White on the defense. 3 tackles for loss, a sack, a forced and recovered fumble. So Sylvester White doing it all for the Raiders on defense. Randall Hansen, 279 yards, a touchdown, and a couple picks. Again, Lions doing their best to put together a solid offensive performance, but the Raiders' offense just being too much for that defense, as has been too much for a lot of teams so far this year. So victory for the Raiders in that interconference matchup there. It was also a big victory for the Denver Broncos, who were up 44-0 at halftime, ultimately prevailed by a final score of 44-17. Peter London threw all of 10 passes for 122 yards and 2 touchdowns. That puts him third in passing yards for the game to Miguel Aguilera, and his backup, London's backup, Adam Johnson, who actually threw for 121 yards in relief. Big day for Michael Carter as well, adding to his touchdown total with a couple there. On 70 yards and 17 yards receiving as well. Russell Garban with 3 tackles for loss and a sack, showing it big in this one. Denver just overwhelming them by halftime and then kind of coasting from there. The Vikings and Seahawks game was really exciting for about 10 minutes in the third quarter, because that's when all of the scoring happened. Christian Sinnott got his touchdown to try to offset the 3 picks that he threw. Kimiko Allard as well got his 2. John Woodward, again, carrying the Seahawks, though he did not get into the end zone, 162 yards on 31 carries. He is really the workhorse for this team. Darrell Dillon showing up with 2 of those picks of Sinnott as well. And the crucial thing for Sinnott was 2 of those interceptions were in the fourth quarter in Seattle territory. So the Vikings did have some chances late in the game to try it off, but a couple of crucial turnovers, and the Seahawks were able to hold on for the win. Fantastic game on Sunday night for the Battle of Ohio, if I do say so myself. Yet again, a big sack line, 14 sacks, with Jeremiah West being sacked 9 times. 2 of those from Lewis Dell. Timothy Taylor on the Bengals having a huge day defensively, 4.5 tackles for loss, and half a sack. The Browns got an early field goal, but other than that, it was the Bengals leading almost the whole way. Jeremiah West, 200 yards and 3 touchdowns. Ronnie Jefferson, also 200 yards, plus another 48 receiving on 6 catches. So Jefferson and Mora, absolutely stellar, carrying those 2 teams. One of Rivera's interceptions late in the game turned into a Cincinnati field goal for a 31-21 lead. Browns came back to score a touchdown late in the game, but were unable to get the last points they needed. Bengals came out with a very close, very hard-earned victory there on Sunday night. Monday night, it was the Commanders and the Dolphins. Commanders having very little trouble, with Jerome Morrison throwing for 551 yards and 6 touchdowns. The Commanders put up as many points in the third quarter alone, 28, sufficient to beat the Dolphins, with Dean Hammonds being held without a score, 349 yards on 57 passes and a single pick by Randy Espino. So big days for Rodrigo Gonzalez and Hector Covarrubias, both of them, and Gonzalez especially with 3 touchdowns, highlighting that performance. So another big victory for the Commanders, staying in first place in the NFC. beating the Dolphins on Monday night. So Morrison certainly gets my nod for quarterback of the week with those 6 touchdowns. Jefferson with 249 combined yards for the Bengals on 35 touches, leading them to a big rivalry win in prime time, gets to the board as well. And then James Carter with over 150 total yards and 3 touchdowns, leading the Jets to victory, providing pretty much all of their points in that close game against the Chiefs, also makes the board. And then, as I'm sure you noticed by the running theme, a lot of sack masters being highlighted on the defensive side. Vaughn Johnson with 3, Sylvester White with 1 sack, but also that forced fumble and recovery. And then John Osmond, 3.5 sacks for the Colts. And then wanted to highlight Darrell Dillon, as I mentioned, with a couple of interceptions in that Seattle game. So lots of strong defensive performances, lots of game-changing offensive and defensive performances to be noted in the Players of the Week this week. Couple of new injuries to report. Tony Hirschberger with a strained rotator cuff, and the Packers fullback Clement Carr, hamstring tendonitis. Both of those should be out 6 weeks. Adding those to the list of Merriman, Miranda, and Ellis that we highlighted last week. Still not too heavy on injuries, but these things do happen. So that is where we stand on that. And speaking of standings, here is where they are currently. Cincinnati cementing themselves as the premier team in the AFC with that big win over Cleveland, standing at 7-0. Vegas and Denver trying to separate from the pack with 5 wins apiece. But as they are in the same division, only one of them could win it. So the secondary team, which is right now Denver, is has the inside track for that top wild card. Miami and Tennessee still leading their divisions at 4-3, and then Cleveland and Pittsburgh right behind them at 4-3, trailing the Bengals, and then Baltimore, who had an early bye, behind them at 3-3. So a lot of activity in that AFC North. All teams vying for playoff spots. But then even not far behind them, the Chargers and the Colts now with that victory. 3 wins for each of them. So they're certainly not out of the running at all. In the NFC, you still have Washington at 7-0, and then the Rams, who were off this week, at 6-0, the last of the league's unbeatens. Chicago and Carolina both showing up strong at 5-2. And then a host of strong teams in the wild card, Philadelphia, Green Bay, and Dallas, all with 5 or more wins in a very top-heavy conference. And then Detroit being the first ones out currently at 4-3, but still within striking distance. Similar picture to last week, AFC with 1 team at the top, and then a huge cluster of teams from 2 to 10. The NFC with 2 undefeateds at the top, and then 6 teams vying for 5 more spots. With both leagues having very, very strong wild cards behind those number 1 seeds. So Denver and Philadelphia in those cases being what would be very, very strong 5 seeds if it were to come to that. But that is where we stand currently. Still a lot of football left to be played. Starting with Week 8, we start our Thursday night primetime lineup with the Jets going to New Orleans. 2 teams who are currently on the outside looking in, but looking to improve. Maybe call it the Myron Everett Bowl, not sure. Actually, no, he was from Carolina. Or has he now played for both teams? I forget. The point is, the Jets and Saints are going to be playing on Thursday night, and you should watch. When we get to Sunday, some great division matchups with Miami going to Buffalo. So a contest for first place in that one. And then Baltimore at Cincinnati. Cincinnati still undefeated. Baltimore being the next division rival, lining up to try to knock them down a peg and maybe move themselves up into the wildcard conversation. In the afternoon, we have another unbeaten, the Rams. They're going on the road to Pittsburgh to face the 4-3 Steelers. And then rounding out our primetime lineup, we have the Giants at Philadelphia. So a great division match there with the Eagles hosting. And then Monday night, we get the Chicago Bears at the LA Chargers. Lots of great football still to be played. Hope you'll stick around next week to watch all the action and join us on the next edition of the SimNFL show to talk all about it. But for now, that wraps up my time. Thank you so much, everyone. Good luck and have fun.